have, but I'm going to try to cover the basics in dealing with deer and deer management in your garden, and hopefully provide you some tricks that you can maybe relieve some of the pressure you're receiving from these animals. As was mentioned, I am an assistant. Well, I'm supposed to introduce my title, right? So I'm an assistant extension professor of wildlife management in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources at University of Kentucky. I'm also the state wildlife extension specialist. That means I am solely in charge of dealing with all wildlife related questions for extension in the state of Kentucky. And I can tell you right now, we have a lot of them. And that has a lot to do with the fact that we have well over 500 species of wildlife that call Kentucky home at some point in the year or other. For those of you that are out of state, many of you have a very similar situation with the vast abundance of wildlife species. Some of you in places like, I saw Missouri and Reno, you're going to have some species that are going to cause you problems that I don't have to deal with, and I'm happy about that. However, I have things to deal with that range in size from frogs to elk and bears. And unfortunately, one of the things that complicates managing wildlife that's different from, say, Europe or Africa is our model of management of the species in North America. And that really is the fact that we are all co-owners of all of our wildlife present in the country and present in the state. So wildlife is viewed as a public resource and managed as such, so that it's still existent for future generations to use and enjoy. And we've spent a lot of time and effort over the last thousands of years, as long as we've been cultivating food, to try to eliminate and deal with wildlife who are also very much interested in the food we are cultivating. And what we can definitely say for sure at this point in time is we're really bad at doing it at 100% success rate. We're really unable to eliminate basically all the species that could be utilizing your garden, your yard, where you're producing food. And that's because they're very adaptive to dealing with situations, and they're very much trying to survive, and they make decisions and risks and take risks to basically consume food so that they survive and reproduce so that they're still in existence. So in reality, unfortunately, and this is especially true for dealing with deer in yards, is learning to live with a little bit of damage is probably going to go a long way. Realizing that despite all your efforts, time, money that you put into it, you're probably not going to be 100% successful in keeping deer out of your landscaping and out of your garden. But you can, be fairly successful at doing that. And it can be just better for your emotional and mental states to just kind of come to terms that you're not going to be 100% successful, but we can get you most of the way there. Now, I always ask the question of, what is so bad about these cute animals? I mean, look at them. They're adorable, right? Who doesn't want to have these things around? And the answer is very easy. You look at it, and I think this cartoon sums it up quite well. If you're in an area with a lot of deer and you're trying to garden, you are providing the buffet, the premier restaurant for them to exist. You are, most cases, probably planting things that are highly nutritious and based on when they're growing are going to be the most desirable plants, especially when we talk about growing gardens. That food source that is very good for us and very healthy for us transfers right over to deer and being just as valuable to them nutritionally as it is for us. The other problem that we get into, and as you can see this long list of species, trees, shrubs, perennials, I don't even have the annuals on here. All of these come down to one thing. They're all on the menu for deer. Deer have been, white-tailed deer alone have been known to consume upwards of almost 750 different species of plants. So they are a generalist through and through. So that kind of knocks back the ability to plant things that are really completely off the menu. And why is that? Why does that matter? And why do you have a lot more problems with deer, say in spring and summer, versus, necessarily in winter, especially in areas that don't have super high deer densities? And for the most part, deer need to consume, especially when they're nutritionally stressed, about 5 to 10 pounds of forage a day. And that generally looks like a mixture of all kinds of plant material, from woody browse to food. Mast is a really important food item for them in the fall. Then, grasses, row crops, your garden crops, to, everything down to the fungi. And their diet will vary seasonably. And it also varies by their age and sex. And that comes back to nutritional needs, and requirements for those deer do differ by season. And that's especially true by sex. When you think about it now, I had all those pictures of those fawns. The need for a female, what she needs to take in nutritionally to support lactation and development of those fawns is different than, say, the males, who at that point in time are trying to grow antlers. So they need a much higher protein content than, say, the female, what she needs to develop milk. Other big issue that you have when you're trying to grow gardens is the fact that fresh new growth that you're producing in your garden, especially early on in that garden, is going to be much more desirable because of the nutritional quality versus older growth that happens later on. And for whatever reason, it seems that timing of growth in spring for when your garden's going on, many times, especially those that start gardens earlier in the year with lettuce and spinach, carrots, and so on, that may be the only fresh growth that has kicked into place in that area, which makes it highly desirable for deer to try to consume. Same holds true across the year, where certain things plants are highly nutritious at certain times. Think sweet corn, right as that is developing. The point, there's a switch right as it kind of happens where the deer will not really focus on sweet corn, and then all of a sudden those this post tassel, and it's become a highly desirable resource. So they are going to focus on what is most nutritionally valuable to them at that point in time to meet those nutritional needs. And unfortunately, a lot of times that means your garden is a buffet of highly nutritious food source across the entire time you're growing. Some other problems that we have with deer and managing them is it comes down to deer behavior, right? They are fairly flexible in dealing with situations around humans and urbanization, which allows them to be a little bit more of a risk taker coming into gardens and backyards, whereas, say, some other species may be a little bit more reluctant. And we see a lot more problems with gardens and humans in general, and with wildlife damage with those species that are willing to take those risks and live alongside humans rather than those that are going to try to avoid them. So they become quickly habituated to their surroundings. As you can see in the picture here, this deer is basically become friends with the neighborhood dog. And where I grew up, I'm from Pennsylvania, originally in Southeast Pennsylvania, about an hour outside of Philadelphia. We knew that the deer in backyards knew the exact length of the leashes that dogs were tied to in their yards. And they would go and basically walk just the outside edge of it. That's how much they can understand the risk that they're under from potentially a predator in that situation. In addition, deer can jump barriers upwards of 8 feet from a standstill, and sometimes even over that if they're at a full-on run for an adult deer that's in good physical condition. But generally, when I talk about fencing later on here, it's an 8-foot or larger fence because of that behavior issue. And then there's another component associated with deer behavior that's allowed them that flexibility to become habituated, and that's really that they've lost their natural predators that existed across much of their range. And that's especially true in urban, suburban areas in the East and central Midwest, where, the main control mechanism used to be mountain lions and wolves. And we still have some what we would call mesopredators around. So the largest of those being bobcats and coyotes. However, through all the wildlife research we have, we've kind of seen that they do not fill that role like wolves and mountain lions used to. They can be a pretty good controlling mechanism, especially for fawns. However, for the most part, they're not going to be able to maintain or lessen a deer population across its range. The other issue that you may be experiencing outside of the consumption problem is every year in the fall and mating season and just before mating season, so starting late September, October, male deer are going to start rubbing their antlers to both transmit hormone communication, olfactory communication to other deer about who's around and what is their status. But they also are trying to sometimes rub off the velvet that exists around their antlers when they're growing their antlers. And this can be, if you have trees in your yard, or if you have Christmas trees, especially is one that, they seem to like that cedars, pines, can cause extensive damage to those plants and trees. And potentially definitely allow pathogens to access the plant, but can also potentially girdle the trees themselves, killing them long term. So that's a different issue in general, and I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on that, but I just want to make sure you're thinking about it, and you may be experiencing it, which is why you're here. And you can do some things with rebar to protect them, but unfortunately, it's pretty hard to keep them away from all trees. So let's get into some of the control options. This may be the similar situation to you're experiencing in your backyard. It's kind of what my backyard looks like at times. And let's start talking about how can you deal with lessening those issues that deer are creating. And this holds true not just for deer, but if you have other wildlife related issues, many of these steps you just have to transfer from what do deer need and what can I take away from deer to what, say raccoons. What are raccoons causing problems in my yard? And one of the first steps that you have is habitat modification. Can we change the surroundings in certain ways to make it less appealing for deer to access that area? Or, in the pictures here, less appealing for raccoons to come in your backyard. Changing the landscape is important. And offers a really good potential mechanism for controlling things like rabbits or groundhogs or raccoons. Not so much with deer. Deer will travel large areas to get to food sources. They're very mobile, where other animals like rabbits, they don't want to necessarily be spending a lot of time out in the open because there's predators that are very effective at controlling them. Deer don't. We just kind of discussed how deer don't really have that issue. But what you can do is try to make your yard less attractive, or the area around your property less attractive, by removing things like artificial food sources. Now, you may be here because your garden is there, and that is an artificial food source. Technically, it's not a native habitat that's out in existence in the ecosystem. Is your artificial food source that you're trying to use to feed yourself. But we have other things. Say you may have a farm and hunt the property. You may be in a state that allows baiting or feeding of wildlife. And if you're experiencing deer issues on your property and you're feeding deer on your property, you're basically inviting them to frequent the area around your garden more often by having food available. Same holds true in not an indirect manner with things like feeding birds. Having bird seed out in the landscape, that is grain, and deer were going to consume that because it is a high value resource, just like if it was in a crop field. There are times of year that feeding birds is really important, and one of those is winter. And usually winter feeding of birds, you don't necessarily have a garden growing, so it's not as big of a deal. But if you're still feeding birds and putting 5 pounds of grain in one spot for deer, raccoons to come in, you're inviting them to come closer to an area that you may have a garden near. So it's not necessary to feed birds in the summer as much. There's a lot of other resources out there. They're not food limited. So it is one thing you can do in the summer and not have a negative impact on birds, is stop feeding, especially if you're having problems with deer in your yard. Other examples of habitat manipulation, just for not necessarily effective on deer, but things like voles and rabbits and groundhogs, mowing the lawn short, removing brush piles, that's all good stuff. One of the things you can do that's seen here is there's tree protectors on these orchard, right? So if you see the cones at the bottom, those are good things to have if you have deer, if you're trying to plant trees that are really young, saplings, 1-2-year-old trees, having them in a cone and providing protection from deer is a good starting point, because they will key in on that fresh new growth. It's highly nutritious, and they'll clip those treetops really quickly, and you'll get a lot of kill from that. So let's talk about other ways to manipulate surroundings, and that includes things like deterrents, scare devices. And there's a lot of options out there. Unfortunately, there's no silver bullet, and their effectiveness really does vary by species and time. How are you trying to scare birds? Are you trying to scare deer? Well, if we're talking about deer, there's only certain ones that work for that. And the time that you're going to have it be effective is going to vary by what you're using. Overall, though, I mentioned how deer become habituated to their surroundings. The same holds true for these scare devices. They will eventually gain an awareness that device cannot actually cause them harm. So you can do things like move it, alter the tempo of noise making, change the device itself. That will help extend that time for those animals to become habituated to them. But overall, eventually they're going to figure things out. Now, there's a couple different groups, including visual repellents, and that can be things like your balloons, your silver pie pans, lasers, predator decoys, owl decoys. There's a lot out there. Now, in terms of impacting deer, lasers seem to have some effect, but when you're talking about lasers that have that, it's the commercial grade that they put up in orchards for birds. That'll play with the deer a little bit. Incredibly effective on birds, but it only buys about a week or two with deer. Other visual repellents, things like the predator balloons, deer are going to get habituated to them very quickly. If they buy anytime at all, I'd be surprised. And if you Google YouTube, you'll probably find some videos of baby deer actually playing with them. So they're not a great option, and they tend to lose their effectiveness quickly at all, if at all, for deer. They do work fairly well on birds in a lot of situations. So next option is what we call the chemical warfare option. And for those of you that don't know, that's a spotted skunk. So we have 2 skunk species in Kentucky. We have the striped skunk and the spotted skunk. And the spotted skunk is about the size of a gray squirrel. It's really tiny, eastern western, and they don't play fair because they use their spray as an actual effective deterrent for predators. But they also will do things like chase mountain lions off of dead deer to eat the deer. So they're really good at using chemical warfare. I'm hoping that I can talk to you about some of the ways you can use chemical warfare to have success with deer. There's a couple different options. Basically, you have a taste deterrent, a smell deterrent. Those are the 2 big ways that chemicals can work to keep deer from consuming vegetation. There are some good options that are effective. Generally, those that contain therum are really good options for deer and rabbits. The bad news is you can't use those options on plants that are meant to be consumed. So if you have concerns about your landscaping over winter with deer coming in, or your flowers, you can use those options and they do work quite well. They do require the animals to consume a little bit of the plant material to get that adverse effect on them. So you may lose a little bit of your plants, but it will keep them from consuming all of them. The downside is a lot of times they're quite costly to repeatedly spray on top of plants. You do have some environmental degradation over time from weather and UV. There is a lot more effective options through the winter. They seem to hold on and be effective longer in the winter for landscaping plants. There is an option for consumption, of garden plants. There's a capsaicin chemical repellent, which is basically hot sauce that has to be repeatedly applied about every other week to be effective, and it does get very costly, and it can alter the flavor of whatever plant you're putting it on. Now, other repellents that exist that I'm going to throw in here in terms of chemical repellents, because it is chemistry that we're playing at, are things like predator urine. You have the homemade varieties, your ivory soap, chili peppers, and so on. They, I will say this, so we, within Extension, we're always pushing science-based information, right? There's been some work with predator urine where using urine for predators that are native to the area that you're in. So for us, it's, coyote urine, bobcat urine around your garden will actually lower the likelihood of a deer using it, as long as that animal is not food stressed. So if it is a drought and your garden is the only thing that is high value food, the animals are not going to care about that smell. If your neighbor has a garden that doesn't have predator smell on it, and yours does, they're more than likely going to go to your neighbor's garden and leave yours alone a little bit more than they do your neighbor's. So it can work. There's evidence that it does work. In terms of the homemade varieties, the vinegar, the soap, the peppers, there's not a lot of truly scientific based research out there on its effectiveness. And the way I like to look at them is that, they're not that costly. They, what's a bar of soap? About $1. So if you want to try them, it's not going to hurt trying them. I've heard folks that swear by it. I've heard folks that and I've honestly seen deer lick ivory soap. So there's a lot of individual personalities within animals, just like there's individual personalities within humans. And that holds true. I brought up the capsaicin, the hot sauce. Did a project during my PhD looking at spraying soybeans with hot sauce with that capsaicin at different concentrations. And I had, we go out and watch how the deer use those plots. And we had the recommended dose to 100 times the recommended dose. And one of the plots at one of the sites, there was a year-old spike buck, that would come out and basically run to that 100 times dose of capsaicin because that animal loved hot sauce. And we all know those individuals and humans that love hot sauce. So there are certain things that may or may not work over time. And we always look at averages, right? So it's worth a shot, especially when it's low cost in terms of trying to implement it. If you have a well-trained dog that will not make friends with deer, they work really well. If you can, electric fence to maintain the dog in a perimeter, they will help protect your garden if you have access to it. If you want to train them or put in that fence, just make sure that they are not going to make friends or get away from your yard. They are quite effective in certain situations. There are other repellents, auditory repellents, that are not necessarily as neighborhood friendly, but have been shown to be effective over periods of time. So propane cannons are one of the items we recommend, especially for orchard producers. They'll buy anywhere from 3 to 6 weeks of protection. And they're really important to implement at vulnerable stages of crop production, right? So using that time, I'm going to have protection for 3 weeks. When is the most important 3 weeks to get protection? That's the best way to use these repellents. Other things that are out there include these motion activated noise production, sonic. They're out there for moles, they're out there for mammals. There's mixed reviews on their effectiveness. Over time, animals will become adjusted to them. I wouldn't recommend them at all for moles, as they don't seem to work. Now, there's less information out there for things like deer. One of the things that is effective is these physical deterrents that exist that are motion activated or even bait activated. Sprinklers seem to be able to, motion activated by that time because that water can be a negative reinforcement where something is actually touching that deer thinking it's being chased. The wireless deer fence, which are these basically electric posts that you put scent wafers on, the deer come up and touch and get zapped. That's a negative reinforcement for the area and can be quite effective. So those are things that, depending on your personal situation with what you have around, in neighborhoods, that becomes a big deal with potential for kids coming over or other animals. These things will not cause a lot of problems. They're just in terms of health related issues. So if the neighbor's dog puts its nose on it, it's going to get the same kind of jolt that a deer would, and it's most likely not going to be a problem for its health, just like a kid touching it. Probably the biggest thing that long-term effectiveness is things like fencing, and spending the money to put fencing in that's 8 foot tall is going to buy you the most protection long-term, and is usually worth its upfront cost, especially if you're thinking about those producers that do farmers markets, those kind of things. It's worth its weight in gold. Now there's options that you can see in the top right corner there for smaller level scale protection that you can use. So it shouldn't be ignored. There's a lot of options out there, but if you put a barrier between the animal and the food, you're going to have a lot more success than if you try to scare that animal away with no barrier. Cheaper options exist. Plastic, 8 foot plastic fence. It just wears down over time. You probably have about 5 years before UV really breaks it down. There's electric options as well, including this offset design, which plays on the deer's lack of depth perception. Animal walks up to a 2.5 foot tall fence, tries to go underneath it, gets zapped, looks at the fence, looks through the fence, and even though there's a 3 foot gap and a 4 foot fence inside, it doesn't know if that, because it doesn't have depth perception, doesn't know if it can jump that inside fence, because it actually can't tell how far away it is. So if you make them both electric, it really is a great method for keeping a lot of wildlife out. And it's one of the ones we push a lot with our producers. There's other single fence designs that you have to kind of bait and train the animals that work. But with these wired fences, you can get a lot higher jolt in there. And if you have bears around, you're going to want like 10,000 volts to keep bears out. That becomes a little bit more of a safety issue if you have neighbors around with kids. I mentioned, there's capsaicin, that hot sauce is a option. But really, one of the things I'm going to tell you and straight up, fencing is the way to go if you can do it. It's going to buy you the best protection from deer. It's a lot harder, unfortunately, to implement for landscaping, right? A lot of your landscaping gardening is there so you can see the pretty landscaping, and putting a fence in front of it's not going to be great. The good thing is, if it's not food-based, there is a lot of options out there, chemical options that work pretty well. You just have to figure out how often you're going to need to reapply it to get that protection, and also understand that you're probably going to lose still a little bit of your plants to consumption until the animals learn that it probably tastes bad, I shouldn't consume that. We work with a couple companies and tried some out, and they are pretty effective. Some of these companies are trying to develop crop versions because of their success on the landscape versions. So nothing is foolproof. Stuff fails. What can you do when you're really overwhelmed with deer issues? And this is especially true in areas where you have super high populations and there's not enough food in the landscape for them to eat. They're going to take more risk and try to consume things, especially if there's nothing left. They will consume things that taste bad, even if it's sprayed, because they're just trying to survive. There are, a variety of plants that the deer will not consume, right? They do have preferences in what they consume. Finding what they do not want to eat and planting that, if you're okay with it, will work and be effective. There's oh man, that picture didn't come through really well. There are groups of plants that are not going to ever really be eaten. Your lily of the valley, peonies, asparagus, onions, poppies, those kind of things are really deer resistant because they just don't eat them. And that's great. I am a wildlife person, so I'm a big proponent of native planting, because a lot of our native species have kind of evolved with browse and can handle being eaten quite well. So if you have a good mixture of native plants in there, they're okay. They respond really well once they're established. So second, third year, they get bit, lose some biomass to a deer. They actually sometimes will actually throw off more flowers because they were, had plants consumed. They're trying to respond to that, compensatory growth. For those that are in Kentucky, the thing I'm going to push here is the fact that many of these species that evolve, forb-wise, have evolved with deer browse, put off some really pretty flowers and would make great landscaping. And they're almost all beneficial to butterflies, bees, and so on. So things like asters, bee balm, black-eyed Susan, coneflowers, columbine, yarrow, and serviceberry is an example for a tree, do really well and in response to being consumed. And they're not highly preferred by deer. Even then, even you have the landscaping, deer, there's other options out there, are going to leave these alone. It's mostly what makes up my yard, to be honest. And then there's even the other options of native species that will not be consumed, including things like American holly, big blue stem, false indigo, hyssops, which are awesome bee plants, pawpaws, which they'll only consume the fruit. So you got to get out there and get the fruit if you want it. The good thing is you can pick it out of the tree if it's a tall enough pawpaw and the deer can't get to it yet. Raccoons are a different story. And some switchgrass, if you want those bunch grasses, are pretty much not going to be consumed by deer and are also native to this area. So that would be my big recommendation, is if you start losing the battle in landscaping and can't seem to, start working in some plants that are deer resistant. And over time, you kind of transition to a point where you have pretty much nothing that they want to eat in your yard. It will take some time to do that, but especially true with landscaping, when you can't put a fence up, this is kind of the way you have to go in extreme situations with high deer populations. Now, for those that are in Kentucky, legally, there's other options. I didn't get, because I envisioned this audience to be mostly backyard folks. I didn't talk about hunting. So for those that are out in more rural environments in Kentucky, you have the right within the state of Kentucky, based on KRS 150.170, to protect your property from wildlife damage for those species that are not federally protected. So that means animals like deer, bear, elk, turkey, those are your ones that can cause a lot of damage, raccoons, your groundhogs, and so on. If they are damaging your property, you are legally allowed to trap or shoot those animals that are damaging your property. Exceptions with that rule being that if you implement this law on deer, bear, elk, or turkey, you have to report that to Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources, just like a hunter does, to obtain a confirmation number for harvest. And you can donate that meat to Hunters for the Hungry or consume it yourself, give it away, as long as you have that confirmation number. Allows you to trap as well, not deer, but as I mentioned, raccoons, groundhogs, and so on. In areas where you have the ability to hunt, it's a good idea to try to knock that population back as best you can. Just keep less mouse needing to be fed in the landscape, the better off you are for your garden crops and so on. With that, I tried to shorten this down as best as possible, as I was instructed to. I'm happy to start answering some of those questions that I see are appearing in the chat box, or anything else that may pop up. So I hope that provides some useful guidance on how to kind of approach things in your yard. But I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have, or specifics about methodologies.